Welcome to Life Expansion After 50. This week's episode focuses on the action step, and more importantly, the space between response and action in the extended stimulus action response cycle. In everyday terms, we often think of a response and an action as one. But I'm making a critical distinction here. The response answers the question, what should I do? The action answers the questions, how should I do it? When should I do it? And with whom? This distinction matters because the space between response and action is where situational analysis comes into play. As the Art of War advises, don't fight if you can't win. And the only battles worth fighting are the ones where victory is assured. And often, if victory is assured and you know you'll win, you don't need to fight at all. The challenge with this concept, expanding the stimulus response cycle, is that many listeners may assess it based on normal conditions and under normal circumstances. It may seem like I'm making much ado about nothing, but I'm talking about normal days on a good week. On a good day of a good week, most of us can access our skills and capabilities. And by the way, those capabilities, we may think of skills and capabilities as the same, but let's say a person has certain skills. Let's say you use skateboarding, they have certain skateboarding skills, but they have a sprained ankle. Their capabilities at that time, right then and there, is not the same as their capabilities if they were completely healthy. I mean, you could extend that example on, but I'm making a distinction between skills and capabilities is because it has to be part of the assessment. Now, on a bad day of a good week, fewer people are able to access their full potential. On a good day of a bad week, fewer still. And on a bad day of a bad week, very few people can rise to their full potential. This is where problems begin because people are thrown into situations. It's a bad day of a bad week. They didn't anticipate it. They didn't train for it. They didn't practice for it. And I'll give you just as an example, when I was doing car driving on the track, I always practiced every time I got to a new track. I always practiced entering the turn at speed way offline because you never know what's going to happen. I wanted to know how the car was going to behave during the practice sessions, and I would enter way offline and make the adjustments, learn what the car is going to do. And it also helps me in terms of passing because now I know how to pass somebody rather than, and anyone who's been on the track knows what happens. If you try to pass somebody on the inside before the turn, you try to stuff them, that can go good and it could go really, really bad. So what I did was practice that. And this is just the point that we want to understand, not just good days of good weeks. I mean, every lap could be a great lap if there's no traffic there. But how can you turn those same lap times when you're going in and out of traffic? Now, this is where the planning fallacy becomes relevant. This is a cognitive bias, the planning fallacy. Humans tend to overestimate what they can accomplish, even when past evidence shows otherwise. Research shows that people often fail to meet their goals, dismiss their failure as a fluke, and then commit to even more ambitious targets. Repeating this cycle multiple times despite reminders of previous shortfalls. When you watch the research and you watch the videos, you think the person is insane because they're faced with overwhelming evidence that it's not going to work. They've tried it 3 times in a row, but they still double down. They somehow dismiss it away. It's because of the cognitive bias. But that cognitive bias, if you've been tracking with me along this series, it's occurring inside that short stimulus response side of the expanded cycle. And in that, we're talking milliseconds. We're talking 100, 200, 300 milliseconds that these things are occurring. And you don't have a chance to stop it in the moment. So this is why we talk about it and I deconstruct it. Now, we're not always going to take minutes to get through a response cycle. That's not the point. The point is to learn these steps to condition in the behaviors that you actually want to have happen. Now, why does this matter? A single poor decision can undo decades of work. And that decision doesn't come out of nowhere. It begins in the stimulus. It begins in the pre-stimulus phase. The expanded stimulus response cycle. The expanded stimulus response cycle, the pre-stimulus phase, is shaped by beliefs, habits, priming, mindset, and physiology. It creates a state of being. That state, when confronted by a stimulus, sets off a rapid chain reaction. Stimulus, reaction, response, and finally action. Now, it's usually talked about as stimulus response, which means it suggests that there's very few opportunities for intervention, and it's a very quick thing. And it actually, when you talk about it as stimulus response, it's almost like it's out of your control. And that's why I'm deconstructing it, to show that while we may not have control so much in the moment, we do have control by being able to train our subconscious to deliver what the conscious mind needs. And I'll cover some of that in the illustration. So each step happens in milliseconds. And at any point, emotions can take over, leading to decisions totally misaligned with your life vision. Now, this is a scenario we've all witnessed, perhaps even experienced. The fear of making one poor decision that could unravel everything we've worked for. This fear can hold us back, keeping us from pushing past our upper limits. Remember the barrier that I talk about in the above the line content? That is part of that stories and habits and limiting beliefs, all of that garbage that's in this barrier that we have to work through. And we've resisted working through it, some of us for an entire life. Certainly, it's easy to find examples where we put it off from 30 to 50, maybe even 30 to 60, and then it becomes, what's the point? And that's why I have life expansion after 50, because at 50 or 60, when you learn these skills, you can rewrite the next 30, 40, 50 years of your life, making the second half of your adult life by far the best half. Now, my goal in breaking this process down is to highlight that the action step is the final line of defense to stop yourself from making a regrettable decision. Once you learn that you have control over that final step and it's not something up in the ether, that gives you power. That gives you personal power that you can access, and it gives you the courage to step into the unknown. Remember, the unknown is seen as a threat by the subconscious. So there's a lot of resistance to going into the unknown. And when you don't have the skills to believe that you can do what's needed in the unknown, it makes it even harder. By understanding this step and implementing the strategies that we've discussed, you'll face far fewer high-stress situations. And when those moments do arise, you'll have the skills and capability to take the right action. Why this matters most. Most of us act in what we perceive to be our best interest, given the information that we have. But in a fight or flight state, especially when triggered by a survival response, our assessment of the situation becomes flawed. Survival instincts can lead us to overestimate threats and take risks, disproportionate to the actual circumstances. Take road rage, for example. Being cut off in traffic is the stimulus. If your state of being is calm and resourceful, it may not bother you. But if you're already frazzled, that same stimulus might trigger an overreaction, honking, yelling, or making a rude gesture. At that moment, the response is just an idea. The action is what happens if you decide to act on it. And once you act, you've entered a completely different situation, one that you haven't assessed and probably haven't prepared for. Depending on the other driver's state of being, now you have another factor involved. The situation can escalate into something dangerous within seconds. Haven't seen it? YouTube, go to YouTube and just search road rage incidents. You will see all sorts of things happen, and you'll see it unfold, and start watching it through the lens of this stimulus response cycle. And you can see how quickly it can escalate. You can see the response. Now, consider the space between response and action. If you pause to do a quick situational analysis, you might recognize that flipping someone off isn't worth the potential. Consequences, risks, dangers, like another driver using their car as a weapon or escalating the encounter further. This pause creates an opportunity to implement if-then planning. If they do this, I'll respond by doing a specific action, which could include nothing, essentially extending the pause. You have to see that that's a possible action as well to your response. Let's consider a relatable example from social media scare pranks. Most of you have seen these. If you haven't, again, go to your favorite platform and just search on scare pranks. You've likely seen videos where someone dressed as a plant suddenly moves, jumps, or whatever to frighten passersby. Picture this. The plant jumps up and the startled victim immediately reacts with wild antics, dropping their belongings, stumbling, trying to run. In mere milliseconds, the entire sequence unfolds. The initial stimulus is the sudden movement of the plant. This triggers an automatic reaction of surprise, quickly escalating to fear. The response is the brain's decision: escape at all costs. Finally, the action follows, a frantic attempt to flee, often resulting in comically ineffective movements as their body struggles to keep up with the mental urgency. A lot of times you'll see people take off running and their feet move and they just fall because they can't run that fast as their brain wants to get away, because in their brain's view, this is a Serengeti tiger already pouncing. So this rapid sequence highlights how a state of being frazzled, calm, or otherwise directly influences how we respond to unexpected stimuli. So let me just pause here for a minute. It took me, let's call it a minute and a half to go through that scenario. But if you watch these scare pranks, it happens in less than a second. This is why I keep talking about the stimulus to reaction to response to action and conditioning these in, because since it's happening in 3/4 of a second, by conditioning in the desired behavior or these desired responses, the desired action at the right times, then that becomes part of the neural network or the neural pathway that creates the outcome. The other thing I want to point out here, and I'll say this again, is that it's easy to see this as muscle memory, but I would ask you, where did the muscle memory come from? Have they done that and those antics before? Maybe they have. Maybe they just got it from watching somebody. This is myelin at play, right? They may have seen somebody do that in a threat, and now they do it. That's sort of how phobias are set up. They watch someone go through a certain set of gyrations because they saw a spider or a snake or whatever the phobia is about, and they do it themselves. They may not even have done it at that time, but they saw it and it was intense enough. And from 0 to 7, myelin develops so easily. The threshold is very low for myelin to be developed, and myelin develops very easily. That's why 0 to 7 is the majority of our conditioning. The brain is very, very malleable. So the myelination happens like exponentially. And this is why these things just come in. It's also synaptogenesis at play. And I don't want to get too deep into it because you start making all these distinctions. It makes it hard to understand. But there are other things at play with the phobia, not just myelin, because myelin takes a little bit more time, but the synaptogenesis that's happening, creating the neural pathways, et cetera. Now, the other thing to point out is that although we think of it as muscle memory, it's also like nervous system memory. And when you think of it as nervous system memory, you recognize that this can happen with our thoughts as well. So imagine the person you just saw on the video, or that I just talked about, and how they respond, and you see it because it's physical, but imagine if that's what's going on inside their brain. Imagine how they're going to respond to threats. And then you understand why it's so hard to go after our goals sometimes, because we recognize that responding that way in thought or speech can completely destroy everything we've worked for. And people just say, no, thanks, I'll just stay in my comfort zone. So let's replay the same scare prank scenario, but this time through the lens of a highly trained operator, a person accustomed to remaining calm and deliberate under pressure. So imagine the prank. And by the way, you've probably seen these people in some of those scare pranks. There are other people walking along beside them, sometimes even closer to the plant. And you may think that they've set it up and they're aware of what's going on. I don't think that's the case in all of them, because you will see, you go back and look at some of your scare pranks and you will see the assessment happening real time. Again, this is milliseconds. but you'll see them look and they'll respond. So anyway, imagine the prank. The plant suddenly moves, attempting to startle them. The operator, walking alongside others, registers the stimulus, the sudden movement of the plant. Here's where training takes over. Instead of reacting with surprise or fear, the operator's ingrained reaction, trained in now into the stimulus response, is to immediately scan for context and threat level. They remain composed, their state of being unaffected. The autonomic nervous system might briefly engage, but through training, they pause the unnecessarily adrenaline spike. It's a conditioned step because they've already assessed that it's not a tiger, and now they can complete the assessment with a little bit more due diligence. And we're only talking about adding a couple of 100 milliseconds. But they've already figured out it's not a tiger, so now let me do an additional scan. All the while happening in this little half a second time frame. And again, if you watch some of these pranks, you don't have to watch long to see. Some of the other ones you might see, maybe the person's a trained fighter. Martial artist response might be to go and attack the plant. I've seen that. I've experienced that where a guy, I was on Hollywood Boulevard and somebody did one of those pranks and I grabbed him and threw him against the wall. That was my response while I was scanning because I didn't know who or what was going on, but that was my response. And it was trained. It was a trained response to immobilize the threat and then complete my assessment. So that's just an example. The response follows swiftly. The operator determines the movement is non-threatening, recognizes it as a prank, and decides to disengage entirely or calmly acknowledges the situation. Finally, their action reflects their response. Again, all this in less than 3/4 of a second. They may continue walking, maybe they make a lighthearted remark, maybe they laugh, whatever to de-escalate the situation. Now, they were unfazed through that whole process or appeared unfazed, but inside they were quickly going through that stimulus response cycle that I'm talking about. While the untrained victim flails, the operator's conditioned habits rooted in deep practice and deliberate decision-making enable them to maintain clarity and composure. It's probably a great example of that statement that it's not what happens, it's your response to what happens. And again, I'll remind you that this is not about muscle memory. It's about nervous system memory. And if that's how we respond to threats in the physical, imagine how it looks inside the brain responding to threats in terms of thought. And I'm going to talk about that because part of it is the distinction between what impulses are coming from the subconscious versus what's coming from the conscious. And there's a handoff. There's literally a handoff. That's my terms. I don't know if a neuroscientist, maybe a neuroscientist would, but I don't know if a therapist would say it this way. But it's a handoff from the subconscious impulses to the conscious. And if we don't recognize that that's a handoff and not equal, then what happens is it's very easy for us to fall into the trap of having the survival reaction become our response and our response become our action, all because we thought that that was the best course of action because it came from ourselves. The reality is those associations are from the past. And using this example of the person jumping, and there's all sorts of different ways you can explain it, but the person who's jumping, they probably learned that by watching somebody get scared and then jump around. When the operator goes through training, that is worked out of them. What happens when the operators are in training, they're constantly stressing them to where all of those normal survival reactions, those survival reaction responses, if you will, it's like they become, none of them work. And because none of them work, this is my way of explaining it, they become conditioned out. That's the process of synaptogenesis, where the synapse moves from the neural pathways that we're using. I should say it moves from the neural pathways we're no longer using to the ones that we are using. So while we're conditioning out those things by facing the fear, facing stress, and none of those responses are working, meanwhile, not only are we moving this, not only is the system moving the synapses over to the new neural pathway, which is the pause, the scan, the assessment, but it also starts building myelin. So the connection strengthens and the neuron itself strengthens, making a stronger pathway. And then that's habit, which is why I like to call the myelin one of the greatest secrets that we have in my in my lifetime when it comes to behavior change. So the difference lies in their ability to process the same stimulus without letting it disrupt their state of being. And by the way, I would argue that they've learned to maintain a state of being because remember, 33,000, call it 30,000 decisions a day. That's one every other second or so, assuming we're awake about 60,000 seconds. We're walking around with thousands of stimulus response cycles playing out. That's our state of being. So the person who's already gotten a handle on this, they're going to have fewer incidents of stressor situations in their life as they move along. So as they go through the day, they're just going to be calmer. It's just, I mean, just work it out for yourself. If you got 33,000 or 30,000 decisions a day, and all of those decisions, or half of those decisions are in fight or flight, then it stands to reason that your action, your response in action in the next stimulus response is probably going to be inappropriate for your life design. So again, years of honing the stimulus response cycle with mindful interventions, stress inoculation, and myelin reinforcement have equipped them to act with precision, even in situations designed to provoke chaos. It's not about being emotionless. It's not about suppressing. It's about control, acting, not reacting, because it's conditioned in at the subconscious level. Very different when I talk about conditioning something in at the subconscious level versus suppressing it. And we'll get into that when I talk about emotions next week, emotion modulation specifically. So these two different approaches are often ingrained by age 27, shaping how people respond for the rest of their lives. However, with focused practice, literally in 3 months or less, it's entirely possible to rewrite that script where that person who jumped, think about the wildest one, in 3 months or less, that can be worked out because where they're now responding with calm, just like the operator. But yet that person could go through their life 50, 60, 70 years with that same script. It's entirely possible to rewrite that script. I don't care how old you are. Yes, myelin does take a little bit more work to grow after about 50, but you can still grow it and develop it, and it still has the same effect. And you know, we're not facing bullets on the battlefield. Typically, we're facing things in business or inconveniences. So having that conditioned in is very, very easy to do compared to living our lives in that kind of a fight or flight state. This is where neuroplasticity comes in, especially myelin, which I love talking about. It's the holy grail of behavior change. It breaks past paradigms. The connection between myelin and action lies in its role as the foundation for habit formation and skilled performance. Myelin, the insulating layer that wraps around neural pathways, strengthening with repetition, allowing signals to travel faster and more efficiently. And an interesting note here is that, and think about it, 4 thousandths of a second either way constitutes poor timing in terms of that signal getting there. In other words, there's a range of about 8 milliseconds, 8 thousandths of a second, that we want to get this firing reaching its destination, which is the next, through the neurotransmitter to the next neuron. So when you talk about a skilled professional with well-timed, with highly myelinated, what we're talking about is getting that range down to 1 or 2 milliseconds. That's the precision when you watch a Michael Jordan doing the moves that he does right on time from years of practice. That's what you're watching. And this is why it gets harder as we get older, because the myelin does start to break down. It doesn't break down by changing habits. What happens is the synapse that moves, the myelin stays there, but you start moving it to another neural pathway. So those neural pathways are still there. And once we activate them, and anybody who's seen how their experience from years past comes into play, you can think of it like that. Once we start using a different neural pathway that has some myelin wrapped around it, it doesn't take long for the skills to come back in. So each time we execute a behavior that's aligned with our life vision, whether it's pausing to reassess in a challenging moment or implementing a thoughtful response, we lay down and reinforce myelin along the corresponding neural circuits. I can't emphasize enough, I've said it probably twice already, that this is not just muscles, this is the nervous system. So thinking, speaking, all of that is impacted by myelin. This series is the unseen power of words. I don't talk about words in every single episode, but keep in mind, our words are a strong priming factor either way. They could prime us to be weaker, they can prime us to be stronger. Other people's words can prime us to be weaker, they can prime us to be stronger. If you've ever seen some long form copy, and I'm talking about online, you click on an ad and now you're seeing this long form copy. It's like pages and scrolling down and you're reading it. You can almost experience it now that I've met it. Just pay attention to what's going on. You can almost experience the dopamine at play, because as you read it, the dopamine starts kicking in because it starts anticipating a reward. And the more you read, and it's telling you all these great things that you're going to have happen, whether it's gym equipment or supplements or a course or something else, right? And you keep reading and you get to the bottom, and then your mind says, well, if this is inside this cost range, I'll buy it. If it's outside of that cost range, I'll have to see. And then you get there and it's in your cost range, or maybe they introduce some other things like the stacking. And now you're seeing that, wow, this value is way up here, but the cost is really small, and you click and buy. And then the course, the supplements, the exercise equipment, the book, it arrives home. And a year later, it's still in the same place you put it. You haven't opened the book, you haven't opened the supplements, you haven't opened the course. There's such a large percentage of time that this happens, which is one of the reasons that inspired me to do this work, Life Expansion After 50. And when I started this podcast, artificial intelligence has been around for a long time, but it wasn't available to us like it is now with ChatGPT and others. When I first did this, my first inspiration was to help people who are older not fall for the scams, because the scams are coming faster and faster and faster. And it's because it's preying on the same thing, like long form copy. They're literally tapping into the dopamine, and this dopamine is, and serotonin, right? The serotonin is sort of like limiting the potential for a decreased mood or worsened mood. And the dopamine is looking for that reward. And together they're creating this behavior, this snowball effect of this behavior. And next thing you know, the person is clearing out their bank account because of a scam. So I wanted to give older people, or people in the second half of their adult life, I should say, I wanted to give them the tools that are necessary to be able to manage their life and not be prey to that. And so it still applies, but now with artificial intelligence doing deep fakes and adding in more stimulus response, or stimulus to create that desired response, running ad copy, testing ad copy, cycling through, doing A/B testing. It's like some of the best copies out there. Of course, we will adjust as humans, we will adjust and then start becoming immune to that. But see, the thing about artificial intelligence is just like trading. If you look at trading 30, 40 years ago, before there was a computer on everybody's desk doing trading, and you look at it today, the same things are at play. At that time, there were, it may have taken days to clear a trade. Now the trades are clearing in real time, so fast that you can see in milliseconds that trades are happening and causing market moves. So it's the same thing, right? It's just that AI will keep catching up as we make shifts, as we adjust. AI will shift, as wheels shift. But see, all those shifts are happening at the effect, not at the cause. What I'm talking about is adjusting your pre-stimulus and stimulus response cycles on purpose so that you become inoculated against that kind of thing happening. So over time, this process not only makes these actions feel more natural, but also makes them more likely to occur even under stress. And that's why I talk about a bad day of a bad week. I like plans that will work on a bad day of a bad week, because they take into consideration the capabilities when a person is at their worst, and that gives me a floor. By deliberately focusing on the right actions, we're essentially training our brain to default to those behaviors, creating a strong, reliable framework using myelin for success in any moment. choice in this space between response and action, it's important to recognize that information from your subconscious is just a data point. By treating it as such, you reduce its influence and make room for continuous, deliberate assessment. Just as I've discussed, reducing the power of external priming to strengthen your internal priming, you can reduce subconscious input to ensure you're exercising your best thinking. By practicing and especially engaging in deep practice, you can make the desired response your go-to action. And remember, while this all makes sense with muscle memory, it's not actually muscle memory, it's nervous system memory. I can't stress that enough because myelination applies to thinking as well. That is the magic of myelin. You're changing the nature of the neural pathways. Let's explore this concept further with illustration. Now, last week, I was talking about how we go from our state of being, which is created from our beliefs, our habits, our physiology, our priming, and our mindset. And in the prior episode, so this is number 70, we've been talking about this since 63. So you can go back there where I spent an episode on beliefs, one on habits, one on priming, one on mindset. Physiology, I didn't spend a lot of time with because there's enough written about that. But the short version is make sure you're drinking enough water so your brain gets the nutrients it needs easily. Otherwise, even slight hydration slows your blood down, and that makes it harder for the brain to get the nutrients it needs, mainly oxygen and nutrients. And it puts you in a stress response. It starts to put you in a stress response. So you want to have your brain acting properly or fully. And you can actually test this just by going for a week. As soon as you wake up, drink a half a liter of water. Just do an experiment and note your mood, right? Note your level of brain fog or your level of clarity, whichever way you want to do it. Do that for a week and then spend a week without drinking at all. No coffee, no nothing for the first, say, half hour of the day. You'll notice that while you may think you need coffee or want coffee, if you just drink water, that feeling of needing coffee goes away because your brain is just starved for nutrients and it's looking for the quick fix. Now, so that leads to our state of being, but because we have 30,000 plus decisions a day, this state of being becomes a habit itself. It becomes a personality, and that personality leads to how we respond to any given stimulus. This stimulus takes us to a reaction, and that could be a survival reaction. If it's a survival reaction, then you already have the cortisol, the adrenaline is already spiking. So one of the things we have to do is recognize that 99% of the threats that we face are not tigers on the Serengeti. So we don't need that level. So that's literally, we condition that in. And there's a positivity exercise that I talked about that we do there. And then from reaction to response, I talked about implementation intentions. And so this on this side is impulse, it's the subconscious. And on this side, it's thought, it's the conscious mind. Those are two different things. But because impulse, the impulse that goes through the neurons or neural pathways is energy and thought is energy. So you can see how they have a similar signature, but there is a difference. You can actually tell once you start doing this work, you can tell when it's coming from your subconscious versus when it's coming from your conscious. And then once you can tell that, what's cool about it is there's a handoff that starts to happen in here. And it continues to here, and it continues on to action. I'll get into another drawing in a moment. But in here, I said that you can use implementation intentions. If this happens, then I will do X. If that happens, I will do Y. If another thing happens, I'll do Z. Some of the words I threw out there, choice, we can implement or reframe. You can literally have an implementation intention where if something happens, you'll do a reframe. I use the example of if you're prone to judge people, you can literally condition in a step that right here that says, before I judge, let me imagine a situation that I was in the same predicament or that I did the same action, and let me see what the situation is. It took me probably 30 seconds to say that, but we're conditioning it in at the subconscious level. Implementation intentions, we're actually telling the subconscious that before you hand this off to me, I want you to package it like this. The subconscious already does that. It's called meta programs. They package associations and then they do handoffs, or they do handoffs to the next set of neurons. And this is when you start getting a lot of behavior. So if you think about sports, you learn a step, and then you learn another step, then you learn another step. Now you put it together. As you start putting it together, that's like a meta program. And now they can do the whole sequence with flowing without any hiccups. So you can literally train your, it's not like anything new. The subconscious already does it. We're just directing it. Instead of the subconscious doing this stuff on its own, I say up here because some people think that the subconscious is above the conscious. Instead of letting it run its thing based on what it thinks makes sense, which is got from 0 to 7, you put it as sub, which is supposed, the name says below the conscious mind, and now you're directing it. So you can direct it to give you that package. And so now instead of responding with, you stupid idiot for cutting me off, you say, oh, 8 out of 10 times when I cut somebody off was because I didn't see them, right? The other time was because I thought I had enough room and I misjudged their speed. So now, instead of responding that you're a stupid idiot, you have some grace because you were handed off a different version of the threat. So this is what is happening with the operator. It's already packaged. The operator's getting, yeah, it's a plant that's moving, but it looks like it's probably a person. There's no way a plant is alive like that. So that's happening in milliseconds. I said you can interrupt the pattern. It's very easy to put in a pattern interrupt. You can put in a pause, a simple pause. If I feel triggered, I'm going to pause. It's not, I wouldn't say it that way because triggering is too late. If I'm hit with something unfamiliar, I'm going to pause. That could be an implementation intention, and the pause is built in at the subconscious level. And that pause, it doesn't have to be even half a second. It could be a quarter of a second or quarter, because remember, the subconscious can process at 11 million bits per second. That's what I'm saying up here. 100 billion neurons, they're firing and wiring together. They process at 11 million bits per second, whereas the conscious mind only processes at 50 bits per second. So since this processing, that's basically a million bits every 10th of a second. So if you pause for just a 10th of a second, you've got potential of a million bits of information going through. The brain can only handle, the mind, I'm sorry, because that is the brain doing that. The mind can only handle 50 bits per second. But we have this thing called a reticular activating system, and that's what's coming into play here, because you're now telling the reticular activating system what's important, what to let through, and how to package it. And we've all experienced the reticular activating system. If you set goals and you're going after these major goals, you get serendipity. The serendipity was always there, but the reticular activating system is making you pay attention to it. I also talked about transformational vocabulary. That's a big deal. I talked about it more in priming and mindset, but it plays here as well. So you can go back and watch one of those videos. And then guided meditation. You can just, oh, and then the proactive would be another one. That would be another good implementation. So implementation intention. So another good implementation intention is being proactive. So when you get this stimulus that's unfamiliar, you could prime in instantly in the subconscious side, be proactive. And so now everything is going through that filter. Hopefully you can see how this is having an impact, or can have an impact on what you're doing. So if we have your response, and we have action, and we said the response is the what. we should do. This is the how, the when, with whom, and I might even add in why. Because the why, the reason that could be useful is that if you are following the response, and now you've done this, and now you're taking the action. You've decided to take the action. You are doing what you said you should do, what you think you should do. But the situation changes. By having the why figured out in advance, you already know when to change what you're doing. Now, action could be a lot of things. Now, by the way, I talked about skills and capabilities. And the reason I make the distinction is because a person might have the skill to, let's say a person in martial arts, they have the skills to do the forms, the katas, they can do the punches and the kicks, and they can do the whole sequence, but they've never fought another person. And now you put them in a real fight with another person. It's one thing to have the skill. It's another thing to have the capability to execute in the way that they should be executed, the timing. This is where that timing comes into play, the neural pathways, the myelination. The more a person fights, the more that timing is going to be right. This is why, fighters, they don't just throw the great fighters into other great, they build them up. They've got to get myelin. They have to build that myelin. Of course, we didn't know any of this. People didn't know any of this because myelin, it was just figured out that it was not inert, and it wasn't figured out that it actually does so much in terms of behavior until the 80s. And it wasn't until 2000 that it became a thing, because the way science works, they've got to do peer-reviewed research, and it takes time. And once there was enough research done, it was declared, yes, this is what myelin does. Myelination actually speeds up and strengthens the neural pathways, and this is directly related to habit and behavior. When you do the action, you can delay it. So what I was saying, by the way, with the skills and the capabilities, let's say that I have the ability in certain skill set, but it happens to be a bad day of a bad week. And in that bad day of a bad week, maybe I've, again, using a sports analogy, maybe my ankle is sprained. I can't do the things that I would normally do. My situation is different. So maybe I choose not to do it. The same thing, it could be you decide that you're going to flip this guy off who just cut you off, but you're surrounded in a town that you don't know. You're in a city, I should say, that you don't know anybody, and you're exposed, and there's crowds of people around, and you're going to flip this guy off in that situation. You've got to be able to assess what are the capabilities. You may know how to fight, but do you have the capability to take on what can possibly happen? And you don't even know what could possibly happen. So I have the 4 Ds. You can delay it, you can dump it, you can do it, you can delegate it. I can go further than that, but just use this as an example that when you get this handoff from response to action, and you're going through the how, when, how will I do it, when will I do it, with whom, and why, you want the subconscious to give you some suggestions of, should I delay it, should I dump it, should I do it, or should I delegate it? Now, I've talked a couple of times about giving your subconscious directions. Some of you may be thinking that's out there, it's woo-woo. Nothing that I talk about is woo-woo. I can explain it all without having to resort to woo-woo. I explain it in terms of milliseconds and the neural pathways, synaptogenesis, myelin. Sometimes I'll slip into talking about epigenetics, like spontaneous remission. I mean, you've got to look at how genes operate in order to get there. But I look at it in terms of, beliefs, priming, so I can break it all down that way. So if you, as an example, one of the things, public speaking is a big fear. I've seen it written, most of you have seen it written, that public speaking is the number one fear. Sometimes it's even more, it's even higher on the list than death, or it's up there with death. Now, I've been told, I don't, or it's been suggested that one of the reasons why fear of speaking is so high is because in our, going way back, hunter gatherer, and even times after that, speaking up in front of the tribal leader or in front of the king could get you killed. They said that's probably why the public speaking fear is so high, but whatever it is. So here's a little thing that you can do when it comes to removing your fear of public speaking. So first of all, if you break down why people are afraid of public speaking as an adult in a rational mind, it's probably having to do with, I don't want to, be caught without and knowing what I'm supposed to say. I don't want to forget my line. So they have the note cards. I don't want to, say something that's incorrect and be criticized, whatever it is. But here's a little, and by the way, when I first started looking at public speaking, the people who were teaching me talked about getting your butterflies flying information. They said everyone has butterflies, but the point is you want to get yours flying information. And what's also interesting is the first few seconds of a talk is when you're most likely to fall into fight or flight. So this is why some people say memorize your opening, because if you memorize and rehearse your opening, do it over and over and over. If you do that, then while your nervous system is most on edge, you get through that, and now you can function a little bit better. That's why sometimes if you've ever been speaking and somebody throws a monkey wrench in right at the very beginning, it may be harder for you to have a clean start. They also say memorize and rehearse over and over the ending, the closing, because you want to get that right. Again, your energy is up high. So I've said before that excitement and anxiety can have a similar signature, and excitement can often trigger anxiety type neurons because of that. But if you can distinguish between the two and see that at the end of the talk, you may be excited because it went well and now you're getting excited, but that could be seen as anxiety. Next thing you know, you start getting fight or flight feelings or symptoms. And so you may rush through the close. This is why you want to rehearse the close. Now, this is before knowing all of this stuff about myelin and neural pathways and all that. Now that you know that, you can actually box the thing and have implementation intentions. There's different ways that you can do it. You can manage it. But here's something that can get you through. So if someone asks you to speak about something on the spur of the moment, calls you out in an audience, could be a big fear that people have. Here's a 1, 2, 3 step formula that you can actually practice. And I want you to practice it now, not to become a better speaker, but I want you to experience what it feels like. I want you to experience how the subconscious can hand off information to the conscious mind. So I want you to get real time with me, preferably not driving. You don't have to close your eyes or anything. I want you to just use your imagination. Yeah, so you shouldn't be driving, obviously. But imagine you're sitting in a crowded room. Let's say the number is higher than whatever your comfort level is. Some people are comfortable in a room of 5. Some people are comfortable in a room of 500. So something above your comfort threshold. You're in a room and there's more people in there than your comfort threshold. And the speaker says, and I have someone in the audience that I want to ask and have them talk about, I want you to talk about automobiles. John, stand up and tell us your thoughts about automobiles. Imagine you being John or Jane, and you're asked to speak in this room of hundreds of people, and they're asking you to talk about automobiles. What do you say? Imagine yourself. How would you form your words? What would you start off with? What's the first thing out of your mouth? How does this go on? What does it feel like in the second minute as you get into the second minute of this impromptu talk? What are your points that you're making? What's some of the things you're saying? And now you sit down. How do you feel about that performance? Now you literally, I'm asking you to think through this. How do you feel about that performance? Now, I'm going to give you some tips. Come back to just, mindfulness, presence right here, and give you some instructions. And I want you to apply these instructions. The first thing you want to do when somebody calls on you to speak, and you're not, whether you're expecting it or not, the first thing I want you to do is come up with a position statement. And the way you're going to come up with the position statement is you're going to look into your subconscious. You're not going to come up with your position statement with your conscious mind. Conscious mind is too slow. We want the subconscious to give it. So we are literally telling the reticular activating system, check the subconscious and give me my position statement. If you've ever fallen off of some high item and you feel like your life is flashed before your eyes, that's sort of what we're tapping into. Now, after it gives you the position statement, I want you to state the position statement with authority, because it's your position statement. It came from your subconscious. It's your best thinking up to that moment, or your best information that you have, because it's already assessed from your subconscious, and it only takes milliseconds. Then I want you to have it give you 3 compelling evidence points. 3 compelling evidence points. And I want you to start speaking when you get the first evidence point, because you know the second and third ones will be there. Then, after the third evidence point, if you have to keep speaking, instruct it to continue giving you evidence points in groups of 3s. Now, let's go through that thing again. So you're sitting there in this room that's bigger than what you would be comfortable speaking in front of. Go into state, you're in the room, and someone says, John, I want you to talk about automobiles. The first thing I want you to do is, what's your position statement about automobiles? Whatever it is. It could be you like electric vehicles, you think that internal combustion engines should be the right thing, you prefer SUVs. It could be anything. What is your position statement? That's yours. Go inside, listen for your position statement. It probably already came up. Whatever comes up is it. Go with that. Now ask it for 3 evidence points to back up that position. Go inside. I need 3 evidence points. And then as you speak, once you do this a few times, it's automatic. You'll keep getting evidence points. But now let's do it real time again. Let's practice. I want you to do it. So Jane, I want you to give me, this audience is very interested in artificial intelligence. Why don't you talk about artificial intelligence? What's your position statement? 3 evidence points. 3 more evidence points. Do that a few times and you will never fear being called on again. I don't care how big the group is. And if you're ever speaking to a group and they say, hey, you know, so-and-so, the next speaker is late. Can you kind of continue for another 15 minutes? Sure. Just come up with a position statement in your mind. What's related to this topic that I really want to talk about right now? I feel strongly about. What's my position statement? Milliseconds. You know what? Related to this, boom, throw out a position statement, and now your evidence points just keep coming. And what you can do is you can then take that position statement and parse it down into smaller position statements and just keep repeating this. You can take a talk and go from 2 minutes to 2 hours if you have to, just doing this by jumping into the next position statement, jumping into the next position statement. That's similar to what I do with these episodes when I do a series. I allow my position statements to unfold and I choose them, and then I pick the ones I want to talk about. So that was a lot. Again, this is the 8th in a series. If you're interested in this, I'm doing a master class January 7th at 7 a.m. Pacific time. I'll post it on my LinkedIn profile. You'll also see it if you're following me on whatever Facebook page you might be watching this on. It's also there. And I'll do a video and publish it as a RSS feed in the podcast. January 7th, it's Breakthrough 2025. And it's a way for you to crush your goals in 2025 and the rest of your life, and building a life design that you'll love living. This 4-hour masterclass with extended Q&A. It's live, fully live. I will be there speaking, and we'll have Q&A and breakout sessions and doing exercises very similar to the one that I just did, so people can experience it. And we're going to go through each step, belief to habit, and we'll do the myelination thing, to priming, to mindset. We won't talk much about physiology. There's enough written about that. And then we'll go into state of being and how to adjust your state of being, stimulus, reaction, response, action, and we'll finish up with the emotional modulation, which is what I'll talk about next week, because sometimes we're not in an emotional state. That's back to the skills and capabilities. We're not in an emotional state. We're being triggered. That would be a good time to delay it. Do the emotion modulation. It takes a minute or two. And once that emotion modulation is done, now you can come back and do the right action or think about it more clearly. And maybe, you know, I say excuse yourself and just come back later. But the thing is, despite all the effort to the stimulus response, we can still be triggered. And when you're triggered, there's an emotional step that we'll do. And that's how you can have agency no matter what's going on around you. So I hope to see you January 7th, masterclass. I'll post it on LinkedIn and my Facebook pages. It's a 4.5-hour workshop. Actually, it's a masterclass. I'll go through this with steps and behavior, and I'll provide resources that you can take with you. And we'll finish it up with a design example, how you can design your life to take a lot of this into consideration. Not a full life design, obviously, but it's a template that you can use again and again as you design your pivots going through life. All right, that's it. We'll see you next week. Same time, same place.